So if you look again at the announcement regarding the final exam, half of it will be chapters 12, 13, and 14. Half will then be on earlier topics. So slight correction there, but an important one for you. So let's see a little more on evolution here. So we get this argument that life forms are all related to each other. We've all descended from a shared ancestor and modified. Evolution has shaped us into different species along the way. So we have diversification of ancient species becoming more modern ones, shaped by natural selection and other evolutionary forces along the way. And you can map that out as a so-called tree of life, with a tree starting from, say, a single stem out of the ground and then branching and branching. And what this means is that we're all related to each other, not just humans to each other, but all life forms to each other. So if you step outside and you look at, say, a squirrel run by, or you see a tree, they're all relatives to greater or lesser extents. And there are strong underlying similarities, even between something like a tree and a person. Here's one. We have this genetic code table, and all life forms are using either exactly the same code table or almost exactly. So if we go and look at, for instance, a messenger RNA that reads CGG, in us, that is going to say arginine, and that's how the ribosome would interpret this particular codon to then start building building a protein. Bacteria would do the same thing. Mushrooms, trees, all other animals, they would all read that the same way. So all life forms have within them essentially either exactly the same or almost the same code book. So we think that the original shared ancestor of us all had this particular code book for deciphering the DNA and passed it on to all of its descendants. That original ancestor had a cell structure with all the things that go with having a cell, not a complex eukaryotic cell, but a simpler type. So we have the deep shared similarity between all life forms, and this is one of the key things, the genetic code that is shared among all life forms. It's because of this shared genetic code that we could take the human gene for making insulin, put it into a bacterium, and they make insulin because they read our genes essentially the same way. We've also taken that human gene and put it into a fungus, and that fungus, a yeast, also makes insulin. Again, the yeasts are using the same genetic code as us. Do you have questions for me on this?
For questions on the test that might involve the genetic code table, should we have that readily available for our notes, or will you have that within the test?
I would include it in the test.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I would never expect someone to have this memorized. So I would make sure that you had it available for the tests, and this probably will appear in a couple of test questions. So we get this tree of life drawn here, and this is actually out of Darwin's notebook when he was playing with this idea. So he was the first one to think of it. Here's a more modern way of representing it. That's on someone's back. This is, I think, Australian evolutionary biologist, and she's had it committed to ink on her back. So she's pretty hardcore when it comes to her evolution studies. And in this case, it looks more like a wheel. But ultimately, the initial point of this is starting at dead center. And then we get branching into bacteria, for instance, here, into the various animals and other microbes and so on, the eukaryotic organisms, from about here on around to there. So we've got bacteria, archaea, showing up in a couple of these early branches, eukaryote showing up through the rest of it. Someone asked me, what happens if they change their mind on some of this? What does she do? I think she's stuck with it. So she took a leap of faith here that this wasn't going to change much, even though someone might later change one of these branches with further study. And she probably won't be able to edit it. Oh well. Well, we get a very strong analogy known as artificial selection as to how you can change species. And in fact, in Darwin's famous book, this is how he let it off. His book on the origin of species, the first chapter was looking at human history with artificial selective breeding and what we've done with that in just hundreds or a few thousand years. We have had a lot of experience with breeding crops and animals, getting our domestic plants and animals. And Darwin defined that as artificial selection. If we were basically making choices about which organism would be contributing genes, and we were knowingly doing that, we were doing artificial selection. That's what happens when we control who is breeding with whom. And with us controlling the breeding, we have made some massive changes in a lot of life forms in a very short time. Excuse me. What would be an example of species that we have made tremendous changes to?
Wolves becoming domesticated dogs?
Yes. In fact, we see dog food ads all the time that make reference to that. We think that happened several different places in the world. And it happened before we had any kind of modern civilization, going back as ancient as 32,000 years ago. And we think in several different places in the world, people bred, again, wolves, the gray wolf, like you see in Alaska now. Those were the ancestors of dogs. Regardless of where that domestication happened, we think it was the same species in every case being domesticated, the gray wolf. But it hasn't taken us very long to make some huge changes. So the question was whether nature could do its own selective breeding program. And Darwin's answer was yes, and it does it through natural selection. So that's the case he put out in his famous book. Well, here we've got a few of the breeds of dogs, just a handful of them. And these dogs, they have been fantastic partners with us through the years. Sometimes we've had them around just because we think they're cute, like I don't know what good a Chihuahua is except for that. But the Border Collies, I mean, those are working dogs, and we bred those where they've been extremely important partners with humans in herding livestock. They're extremely smart, they learn various commands, and so they're something that are important partners, and they have been for thousands of years with humans, keeping track of other domesticated animals. And yet it all goes back to this same ancestor, Canis lupus. Here's some other looks at the different breeds of dogs. Like that one looking so savage, you can definitely see a trace of wolf going on there. Well, we have hundreds of breeds of dogs, and it's only taken mostly a few thousand years to produce them. I mean, we're still doing it with breeds like Labradoodles and so on, newer breeds, as well as some of the older ones. And it hasn't taken us long at all. And we haven't had to use advanced biotechnology. We've basically done it through selective breeding. If a dog had a characteristic that we liked, we wanted to make more of those. And so we could get a dog that was, say, stretched out with short legs, like a Chihuahua. Or not a Chihuahua, a Dachshund. And in that case, Dachshunds are good at, say, crawling into pipes and killing rats. So we have them as ratters. Lots of other uses for these different dogs, and a lot of it has been just breeding for the sheer joy of it, for people that are dog lovers. But it hasn't taken us long to do this. Thousands of years, not millions or billions. And it isn't just dogs. We've done it with crops. Here, this one, Brassica oleracea. That's a wild weed, which I don't have a picture of, but it's a basic mustard weed. So you'll see often wild mustard, weeds that are growing with tiny yellow flowers on them. That's an ancestral species that we use to breed all of these. All of your cruciferous vegetables that are so rich in vitamins, like broccoli, these are all the same species. So you could take these plants and interbreed them if you wanted to. I'm not sure what you would get, but as it is, selective breeding of the same plant has produced all of these and more. So it's not taken us very long to do that, just a few thousand years. And people have bred great varieties of these pigeons. This is something Darwin got into. He bred pigeons partly as a model for his natural selection theory. And you have these pigeons that look like they're different species, but they're not. This is again done by human selective breeding. So you have Darwin here developing his idea, his theory of natural selection. And he came back from the Beagle trip in 1836, and he published a lot of other things, but he was keeping the evolution theory close and not spreading it out to the wide world because he knew how revolutionary it would be. He knew it would upset people. I mean, it still upsets people now. So he was right to be concerned about that. He wanted to be a perfectionist and make sure he had absolutely proven the case for it. And so he spent decades developing the idea, but he kept it to himself, except for some other trusted scientists that he talked with about it. And the problem is that science doesn't stand still. Here we are 22 years after Darwin comes back from the Beagle voyage, and there's another guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, and he's working in the islands in Indonesia and Malaysia, and he comes up with the same idea. He calls it something else, but he's thinking of natural selection too. He's read some of the same books that Darwin had. He's followed the same lines of thought. He's surrounded by this tropical biodiversity. He wonders where could all these species have come from, and he hits on the same idea. And he writes a paper about it, scientific paper, and he's afraid it's nuts. He's afraid his idea isn't any good. And so he decides he should send it to a trusted scientist back in England to review it. Out of all the people to send it to, he sends it to Darwin and asks him, here, I have this new idea. What do you think of it? What do you think Darwin thought of it?
But it was his idea.
Yeah, he about has a heart attack, you know. Here he's been sitting on this idea for 22 years, and this other guy's about to take it away from him. Well, instead of burning the paper or something, Darwin goes to the other scientific friends that he'd already been talking with about this in England and says, help, what do I do now? And they said, okay, well, in the first place, we know you've been developing this for a long time because you've been talking with us about it. So don't worry, you'll get credit. But Wallace deserves credit too. And so the other scientists arranged to have papers from both men presented at the same time in 1858. So Darwin has a paper put together. They submit Wallace's paper, and both of them appear together in the same journal at the same time. They're the co-discoverers of evolution by natural selection. Then Darwin rushes ahead with getting his famous book written, and that's what everyone hears about. But actually, a year before his famous book, Darwin and Wallace together published papers on that idea. So Wallace has ended up with a lot of the credit, even though with his other books and the fact that he worked on it sooner, Darwin gets most of the attention, but it wasn't just him. It's just one of the more unusual ironies in science that it happened that way. Out of all the people Wallace might have sent the paper to, he picks out the one guy who is most likely to freak out when he reads it. So we have all of that. And one thing with this, I think I want to show you, is a thing dealing with sickle cell disease. I'm pretty sure that we did not see a short film about sickle cell. Am I right about that?
don't remember.
I don't think I remember seeing this specifically a film about sickle cell.
Yeah, did we talk about sickle cell with malaria being involved?
Yes.
Did I show you a movie about that?
Not that I remember.
Okay, then. I'm going to guess, and the reason I'm not sure is because I was doing this in my other class too, my 213 class, and if I think back 2 weeks, I know I did it with their class. I'm not sure if I did it with you or not, but I'm going to say that what I probably did with you is I talked about it but didn't show you the film. So let's take a look at a short film that is looking at inheritance of sickle cell and how it actually protects us from infection by malaria. Malaria is a severe disorder, infectious disease affecting the blood, and it's been a powerful selective force on humans. It's one of the top killers of humans through time. I think smallpox was the top, but malaria would come in maybe in second place behind it, given the long history that humans have had in Africa, for instance, and other parts of the world that get malaria. So malaria has been a powerful selective force on humans. It shaped our evolution, and we're going to see how sickle cell actually fits into that. So let's take a look at that. Because it turns out that sickle cell is, in a way, humans' best defense against death from malaria. So I'm going to start this up, and then I'll have to make sure you're able to see it. I'll be maximizing the screen for you. You're not missing anything yet.
Devon and Sky Cooper are brother and sister. Both of them have sickle cell anemia.
Are you able to see the film?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
All right, so let's watch this, about 12 minutes or so.
Before the advent of modern medicine, sickle cell anemia almost certainly meant death before adulthood. Even today, young patients can suffer strokes and organ failure. Sickle cell anemia is a genetic disease. Parents of those who have the disease might not have it themselves, but both must carry the sickle cell character in their DNA.
So how's it going? Good. Can I see your hands? This is pretty. Where'd that come from? Is that from Brooklyn?
Besides some bone pain, Sky leads the fairly normal life of a 13-year-old girl. But her younger brother Devon has suffered acute chest syndrome and has already had his spleen removed.
So you don't get any more belly pains? That's good.
Sky and Devon's symptoms arise from the fact that some of their red blood cells become misshapen, crescents instead of discs, preventing enough oxygen from being delivered to all parts of the body. It's not completely clear why symptoms are variable. What is most perplexing about sickle cell disease is that it's not rare.
So in the United States, we think there are between 70 and 125,000 persons with sickle cell disease. However, that doesn't take into account immigration and other patients or persons coming from other parts of the world into the country.
In fact, in some populations, African Americans, for example, the incidence is as high as 1 in 500, astoundingly high for a deadly inherited disease. Didn't Darwin teach us that harmful traits disappear from the gene pool through natural selection? Why is sickle cell anemia so prevalent, and why in particular among people of African descent? The answers to these questions began with a remarkable set of observations from an unlikely person more than 60 years ago. Tony Allison has spent most of his career as a medical doctor and molecular biologist in the US and England. But he grew up in East Africa, and he's quick to recall his formative years in Kenya.
The point is that we lived in the upcountry, and we used to go to the coast every year in August for the holiday when it was a little bit cooler than at other times. So we had the trip all the way down, which was usually with a truck and a car. And so we would camp on the way in Tsavo, and there would be lions roaring around, so it was really quite exciting.
Those are the infamous Tsavo lions.
Those infamous Tsavo lions.
Around 1950, biologists didn't know a lot about the details of evolution because we didn't know really how heredity worked. The structure of DNA had not been discovered yet. Genetic code had not been cracked. So we know that while evolution was due to genetic changes, we didn't know how those genetic changes took place whatsoever. So there were holes in the whole picture of the evolutionary process. And Tony Allison was probably the least likely person you would imagine who would fill one of the most critical holes. He grew up far away from the centers of science in Europe and North America. He was really interested in natural history, and he loved the Kenyan wildlife, and he visited archaeological digs that were going on at the time. But it was a really circuitous and serendipitous route that led him to an enormous discovery in evolutionary biology. Tony first went to university in South Africa, where he studied physical anthropology, then to medical school at Oxford. He had a deep interest in human origins, but not so much in ancient stones and bones. Tony was interested in blood. Could the common ABO blood types say anything about the evolutionary history of East African tribal people?
And I actually learned just before going out about the sickle cell condition. Nobody really knew the frequencies of sickle cells in East Africa, so it was a barren slate, so to speak.
Blood samples from people carrying the sickle cell character appear quite normal until oxygen is removed. Tony learned that adding a chemical agent to the samples would quickly reduce oxygen and reveal sickle cells, if they were there. This gave him an easy test to score blood samples for the sickle cell character.
What was striking was that you had high frequencies of people carrying the sickle cell character in the coast and near Lake Victoria, and very low frequencies in the high country in between in Nairobi.
What could possibly account for such a striking disparity? The sickle cell character was understood to be genetic, not environmental. Tony had grown up in the dry Kenyan highlands, but he knew the warm, moist lowlands were a breeding ground for the Anopheles mosquito that carried the malaria parasite, Plasmodium falciparum. And it dawned on him, the places where there was a really high incidence of sickle cell is where there was a really high incidence of malaria. Bang. Now it was a burning question that confronted Tony. Could sickle cell and malaria be connected? And if so, how? It was a radical notion that a genetic disease could somehow be connected to an infection. When you went back to Oxford, you had this idea of a linkage between sickle cell and malaria, but you hadn't published it. Did you know it was a big deal? I mean, did you think
Sure it was a big
it was a big deal? So you were,
But that's why I wanted not to go off half-cocked.
Yeah.
I wanted to have a really complete story.
So he decided that he had to sit on this idea until he got a chance to test it properly. So a key element of the scientific method is to come up with a hypothesis. That's great, but you've got to test it in every way possible to see whether or not it can hold up to that sort of scrutiny. That's how science moves forward.
So the scientific method essentially means that you address a problem and try to find a solution. And so you look at children of the appropriate age and find out whether they are in fact protected against malaria. And if that's the case, you predict that you will have high frequencies of sickle cells only in areas where malaria is endemic.
You wanted to know that this correlation held not just in Kenya, but everywhere. It would be important to look directly at the incidence of malaria and sickle cell in as many areas as possible. So, Tony went on a sickle cell safari. He wanted to gather blood samples from all over East Africa to really test this correlation. And now he was a trained medical doc, so he had something to offer. So he would go into the market on market day and offer to do checkups on children and just take a little finger prick or a little heel prick, get a little sample of blood. The first thing he did was look at the malaria parasite load in each sample. Then he tested for the sickle cell character. He found that children carrying the character had a lower parasite count, as if they were partially protected against malaria. And when he examined the blood of about 5,000 individuals, a really massive study, the correlation was really clear. So clear, in fact, that he could really draw a map of East Africa and shade in the areas of high incidence of sickle cell, and they were superimposed right on top of the areas of high incidence of malaria. Bang, that was it. The many samples and detailed maps made it clear there was a connection between sickle cell and malaria. But to understand how sickle cell might protect people from malaria required thinking about the genetics of sickle cell.
What happens is that genes are lined up on chromosomes, and one has pairs of them with the exception of the sex chromosomes. And this means that you have two copies. So the copies can be the same or they can be different. And if they're the same, they're called homozygous. And if they're different, they're called heterozygous.
When an individual finds a partner and reproduces, one of each pair of chromosomes is passed on. If the parents are both heterozygous, carrying one sickle cell and one normal gene, odds are 1 in 4 that the child will be sickle cell homozygous, 2 in 4 that the child will be heterozygous, and 1 in 4 that the child will carry 2 copies of the normal gene. In the absence of malaria, there is strong selection against the sickle cell gene. However, in a malarial environment, individuals born with 2 copies of the sickle cell gene and those born with 2 copies of the normal gene are both at a disadvantage. One gets sickle cell disease, the other is most vulnerable to malaria. Tony's brilliant insight was that those that carried just one sickle cell gene had an innate resistance to malaria. Malaria tipped the selective balance in favor of heterozygotes. The evolutionary trade-off is that protection from malaria comes at the cost of more sickle cell disease in the population. The sickle cell mutation was not the best genetic solution you might imagine to resist malaria. That's not how evolution works. It was the most available. A simple typo, A to T, in the gene that encodes hemoglobin. Mistakes are made in the copying of DNA in every generation. You and I were born with about 40 or 50 mutations that didn't exist in either of our parents. It's just part of the nature of copying 3 billion letters in the process of reproduction. And when those mistakes arise, a typo arises in the globin gene. For most of us, that would be a bad thing, but if you live in a malarial area, it gives you an edge against the malarial parasite, so that mutation is retained.
Well, fitness essentially is a measure of whether a particular gene is likely to be passed on to the next generation. And this means that for that to happen, the individual carrying that gene has to survive to reproductive age, and secondly, has to reproduce.
Now you had a sense that you had this explanation that was general to the prevalence of sickle cell and its correlation with malaria. You didn't quite know the mechanism, right? So
that's right.
What did you do next?
Well, I have to say, I let that part of the story to others because it's quite a complex story. I mean,
a large body of subsequent research has shown that the sickle cell mutation compromises the ability of the parasite to reproduce. Thus, a mutation that creates one genetic disease can also protect against another disease. What Tony gave us was a fully worked out example of evolution by natural selection. And the amazing thing was this was in humans. This is how natural selection was working on humans in real time, in the real world. Tony's map of East Africa was a stunning achievement, but he could go further than that. He knew that there was a high incidence of sickle cell in southern Europe, in southern India, and in other parts of Africa. And it turns out these were all malarial zones as well. And so his map applied not just to East Africa, but that whole part of the world.
When I'm explaining about the origins of sickle cell disease and its association with malaria to children or their families, they often look at me with incredulity. They don't understand. Oh, you're kidding, right? This is all to do with a mosquito infection. As our species has been able to move across the globe to areas with low malarial incidence, this gene is now really more of a nuisance than anything else. There's not really a clear selective advantage for them in Boston, let's say. But it takes thousands of years for the population to change and for genetics to change based on the pressures around them in the environment.
What Tony Allison did, first with his sharp intuition and then with his rigorous research, will stand as a monument, bringing our own evolutionary process into the light.
Okay, so here's a question for you. Why not just have everybody be heterozygous with one normal and one sickle cell allele? Wouldn't that be perfect? Is there a reason it couldn't be that way? To have everyone in the population be heterozygous?
Because eventually offspring would be homozygous.
Sure. Two heterozygotes getting together, half of their offspring would be homozygous one way or the other. So what happens is you're always going to have, in a malarial environment, you're always going to have some people being born with sickle cell, others that are born normal, but the ones that get the best protection are the ones that are the heterozygotes. And so strong malaria, lots of malaria in the environment, has selected humans to have overall more abundance of the sickle cell mutation. And then in other places like, here, for instance, with no malaria, the pressure is toward having fewer copies of this gene. Now, that used to be something that was a pretty deadly condition, to have the sickle cell disease. It's not anymore, at least not when you have advanced modern medicine. In this country, the life expectancy for people with sickle cell is supposed to be around 68, which is close to normal. Even 20 or so years ago, it was more like 48. So we've made some large improvements in dealing with it. We can even cure it outright with a bone marrow transplant. If you get bone marrow from a donor, compatible donor, but who doesn't have the sickle cell, that person's bone marrow will make normal hemoglobin and normal red blood cells. So that's an actual cure in that case. So this is more treatable than it used to be, better than cystic fibrosis. That one continues to be highly deadly. I notice I'm getting some chat messages here. Okay, all right. So that is something that I wanted to then show you as an example of evolution happening basically in real time with humans, real time in the sense of over some thousands of years. Humans developing then this adaptation that's let them partly resist the harmful malaria. So, but if we go looking for fossils, I think we can do that some. So we've got here a recreation of a snake that we used to find around Colombia. This is a little bit after the dinosaurs went extinct. The dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, except for the birds. We think of birds now as being modern dinosaurs. Ancestral birds managed to survive the mass extinction that got rid of the rest of the dinosaurs. But this giant snake is something that then developed in Colombia a little while after that, and it was huge. These snakes weighed several thousand pounds. In this recreation, you have one that is actually swallowing a small alligator there, and these, I'm sure, were top predators in their habitat. The reason I bring this up is that there was a display. This same display was traveling around the country, and it was at the Burke Museum near the University of Washington a few years ago, and I went to see this exhibit there. So here it's being shown somewhere else. But that's an example of fossils. Here, this one, biggest fossil spider found. When I saw this picture, I thought, oh, great, this is going to be something like out of Lord of the Rings, giant fossil spider. Actually, the spider was only about that big, so not that impressive, just like modern spiders. But this is an example of a fossil from some millions of years ago. Fossilization itself has given us a lot of information about life forms of the past, and it involves going from an animal or other life form that was alive at one point and becomes entombed, generally gets buried, and usually in an oxygen-free environment, so decomposition is slowed down. So you can have, for instance, a life form like this nautilus getting buried under mud, and you're left with, say, these marine fossils that were a different species, but similar to the modern chambered nautilus. And what we end up with generally is preservation of the hard parts. Generally, it's going to be something like a shell or a bone or an insect exoskeleton, something like that. Something that is hard and resistant to breakdown usually is what ends up being fossilized. It's very rare to find soft tissues that are fossilized. So now and then we get lucky and we find a fossil. At that, it's usually going to be a record of the hard parts, things like shells. But here's an example of fossils, and in this case, we're not seeing the actual animal or what used to be alive. What we're seeing actually here is a record of its behavior. These are Tyrannosaurus rex footprints, and we're able to see how long a stride was for our famous T-Rex. In this case, it was stepping pretty far between these footprints. So trace fossils are different from what you would normally think of. They give us a record of behavior, in this case, stepping, which we can use to estimate things like, could a T-Rex really outrun a human? Things like that. Well, here's one of those ichthyosaurs that I've mentioned before. These were the ones that were marine reptiles with giant eyes. These giant eyes were the biggest eyes that have ever existed, about that large, about 13 inches in diameter, the size of a big dinner plate. And these were supercharged air-breathing marine predators, similar to, say, modern dolphins and porpoises. Air-breathing, diving into the water, going after prey. They didn't use sonar, so how did they find their prey in the water? Say down where it's dark.
Their giant eyes.
Giant eyes. That was a different solution to the same problem. Dolphins and porpoises have the problem of locating prey even if it's in dark water. They use sonar to do it. These guys didn't have sonar. Instead, they evolved giant eyes. And with that, you could dive down 1,000 feet below water and look around, and it's like daylight to us. So the giant eyes gave them a way to see in the dark. So similarities here to modern dolphins, but with some important differences too. You have fossilized wood, petrified wood. In fact, I've got a little sample of it here. There's some wood from Oregon, so we've got some tree rings that are preserved within that. Give you a little more light on that. So wood will get preserved. We have other things like these. That one is a straight-shelled version of a nautilus, similar to what we had back here. The way that nautilus has its chambers, or down here, these ancient versions had their chambers. If you imagine it just not coiling, you end up with a straight shell. It's still has the same sort of arrangement where you're going from a small chamber and then getting bigger and bigger and bigger chambers as the animal ages. This is just a non-coiled version of a nautilus. So you have the petrified wood. Here's where there's a lot of it in Petrified Forest National Park. We got all these cookies here where this old conifer log shattered into many pieces. This was from a fossilized conifer. And over time, water moved through the fossil and it replaced the organic parts with minerals that still keep the same shape. So petrified wood, 200 million years old. You get around to our area, we find a lot of fossils here that are from a tropical climate. Like down there at the bottom, you've got palms there which turn up around Bellingham. That's about 45, 50 million years ago. We had actually palm trees. It was a tropical rainforest in this area with, for instance, crocodiles. And, you know, I've seen some of these palms myself. I've gone to the same place where they got this one from. And you can see these palm fossils exposed right next to a highway cut on Chuckanut Drive, just south of Bellingham. So we used to have a tropical climate here. All of that's changed, of course. Here's an example of a fossil preserving soft parts. This is the very rare thing that shows us what soft tissues look like. This animal died, it settled into fine mud, and got buried under other mud, and it was gentle enough that actually that preserved the shape of the animal as it was gently pressed into the mud below. We have insects like mosquitoes trapped in amber. Where does amber come from?
Is it tree sap?
Yes, it is. And sometimes trees that are injured, like a ponderosa pine I used to see at Oregon State University, that tree put out just huge amounts of sap, oozing and dripping down it everywhere. And that's a perfect place for trapping insects, or even bigger things like frogs occasionally have been found in amber. But this gives you some of the best preservation of soft tissues. And it's trapping something inside of a mineral and preserving it for all time. Even fossil dino poop, that's what this is, coprolite. That is a big fossilized fecal mass. And this is why I always tell people, if your friend's a geologist and says, hey, can you come over and help me move? I'll buy you a pizza. You should run for your life the other way, because anyone who's a geologist collects this stuff, and you'll be breaking your back moving 500 pounds of dino poop, any kinds of rocks that look interesting to a geologist. Your geologist friend will have like 10,000 pounds of rocks around the house and big door stops and other things. You will break your back helping that person to move, so run the other way. We even get baby mammoths that have turned up, sometimes frozen in the permafrost in Siberia. This is basically an extinct species of elephant that used to live in Siberia. And we have found some with actual meat still on their bones, like you have in this case. It gives me hope that we'll be able to clone this species and bring it back to life. So, lots of different kinds of fossils. There's many places that we find them. I want to show you some that I've seen going to some other places. So I'm going to try to bring that up here. This is being a little resistant. Here. Okay, so if you're down around LA, there is a great fossil locality that is just a few miles west of downtown Los Angeles. It's right on a major street there, Wilshire Boulevard. Wilshire Boulevard has things like Lexus and Mercedes dealerships. It has art galleries. It's a kind of a high-end part of town. And there's an area there known as the La Brea Tar Pits. And It is just west of downtown Los Angeles by a few miles, about halfway between downtown LA and Beverly Hills. So again, this is kind of a high-end part of town. And it's amazing to me that you would have a really world-class fossil site right there for the public to come and visit, and it's in the middle of the city. What happens there, it's related to some of the geologic history of the area. Los Angeles historically has had a lot of oil. You can go around LA and find lots of oil rigs. Many of them aren't operating anymore because they've pumped out all the oil. But that area historically has had a lot of petroleum, and with all those hydrocarbons, you get some of that thick tar seeping to the surface. And we have mined that to use for asphalt on roads, but also these tar pits have been a great place for trapping animals over thousands of years. And what will happen is that you'll have an area that gets covered up with water. You've got this deep, thick tar there. And a lot of the time it doesn't look inviting, but after a heavy rainstorm, this will look kind of like a lake. And animals can come along and try to get a drink, and they put their foot in the wrong spot and they get trapped. So over the years, that has happened thousands of times with animals getting trapped in these, and they end up with their bodies going under the surface in the tar, rotting away, leaving their skeletons. Occasionally a person goes in. They've had to save a couple of people that have been stupid and gone out there just to see what would happen. But what has happened over time is trapping of elephants. For instance, these mammoths getting trapped, as in this model. This is obviously a recreation. But if you imagine elephants of various types walking through Los Angeles, they did back in this time. And we're talking like a few tens of thousands of years ago, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago. Also big predators like the saber-toothed cat here, Smilodon fatalis. These were pretty scary predators, and that's also the state fossil for California. You find a lot of the big cats in the tar pits. Here's a place that is currently being excavated. They say that they've already gone down through 15 feet of tar, removing it and pulling out any bones that are there. They estimate there's still 5 more feet in the fossil layer that's below here. Some discussion here on the chalkboard saying what turns up. And here, these are the kinds of things that they found in that pit, 91. Look at some of the things that have been in there. Do you see things there that would not be alive in the Americas today?
Yes.
Like what?
Like the camels.
Yes. Imagine camels around Western Washington. Well, there were. These ground sloths were similar in size. If you see a sloth today, it's going to be a little tree sloth, maybe like in Panama, and they're like the size of a dog. Well, these ground sloths were more like bigger than a bear, more like the size of a horse or cow. We had horses there, which later became extinct, and then the Spaniards reintroduced them 500 years ago. Ancient bison was a different species of bison than we have now, bigger. The mastodons certainly are not native here anymore. The short-faced bears were terrifying, giant bears. We think very fast runners, and boy, I've seen a skeleton in one of those and they look scary. Giant jaguars, those are extinct. The saber-toothed cats, dire wolves. Has anyone ever seen a dire wolf, maybe in a TV show?
In a TV show?
Yeah. Yeah, which one?
Game of Thrones?
Game of Thrones, you got it. Different species of wolf, bigger, better able to crunch through bones, a stronger bite than our modern gray wolf. Well, that's the kind of thing that's turned up in this place. What's strange about it is that it looks like a topsy-turvy ecosystem. Usually, if you were in a place like, say, an African savanna, and you maybe were looking at zebras and giraffes, would you see just as many lions?
No.
Probably not. Generally, what you get in ecosystems is you've got more prey and not as many predators. Here that looks backwards. And what we think happened is that now and then an animal like maybe a bison would get trapped in the pit, and it would be setting, out all, it would be making all kinds of distress calls. In its agony, it would be trapped and making a lot of noise, and that would attract in scavengers. And a lot of these other animals, like the saber-toothed cats, would say, okay, here's an easy meal, and they get stuck too. So one bison might attract in 10 of the cats. And we think that maybe happened like once every 10 years. It wasn't a constant thing, but now and then things did get trapped. This little pit is the size of one of our classrooms at the school. It's small. I mean, you could just pace from one end to the other in a few seconds. And yet, this pit, they have found bones from 27 Columbian mammoths in there. Columbian mammoths were bigger than modern African elephants. These were about the biggest elephants ever to exist. And over the centuries, this trapped 27 of them. Well, they have a big museum there, and around the outside is this relief sculpture that runs all the way around, showing you what happened there at different times, recreations in this relief, like right here. We have here one of the mammoths stuck in the tar, maybe dead by this point. Saber-toothed cat is trying to eat it, but now it's getting trapped too. And that sort of thing we think happened there a lot. You go inside the museum, 404 skulls from dire wolves on display here. And there's out of Game of Thrones. I think that one was Ghost. But one of the, 6 dire wolves that they had there at the opening of that show. And these were exceptionally large as wolves go. The species is extinct, but they were well represented in California back at this time. Talking about them, here's a Columbian mammoth, huge animal with really giant tusks. There's the tusks. And the brown sloth. These, again, around the size of, say, a horse or a cow or a camel, big animals. And then, just a few weeks ago, or right before the quarter started, we were in South Dakota. I'd never been there before. And we got to another fossil site right there. It's called the Mammoth site. And this is on the south side of the Black Hills. And there, they've also got lots of fossil mammoths, the big Columbian mammoths like this one. And what's happened is that there was a site there that they think was a lake. And it had kind of steep sides, and it had a lot of mud in the bottom. Instead of tar, mud trapped the animals. The elephants would come along and try to get a drink, and sometimes they would slip in and not be able to get out. And so at this place, the scientists have removed a lot of the overburden, a lot of the rock, and they've just revealed the bones and left them in situ. So you're able to see these bones left as they were from the animals. And they have this illustration of different sizes of elephants and mammoths and mastodons. And that's my wife. When we were there, we were gloved up. Hardly anyone else was. Go around this gift shop and museum, hardly anyone had a mask or whatever. But again, that's one of the scientists working here where they've gone and removed all the rock that had this entombed, and we are able to see these animals in their positions as they died. So these are some extinct species, and this is the sort of thing that was giving rise to the idea of evolution, that life forms had changed through time. Because we find, as we go down in the rocks, we find life forms that were alive then and aren't alive now. And a lot of the life forms that are here now weren't alive back then. And as you go farther back in time, there's more of a trend in that direction, giving the idea that life forms have changed through time. Do you have questions for me on any of this? Well, if you go to LA, you can try out the tar pits. I told my sister we were going there, and she gave me a funny look, like saying, why the hell would you want to go there? And I just told her, well, my wife and I were both science geeks. We're into that kind of thing. So that's what we did. Not all that we did. Well, let's do a little more here. Oh, not that one. That one. Now, here we can see some linkages between ancient life forms and modern ones. Here we're looking at two early reptiles. These were around 300 or so million years ago. These are ancient life forms. And you look at the skeletons, and there are a lot of familiar features that show up in these skeletons. We think these were some of the earliest reptiles that were on the planet. And we think these were ancestral to modern birds and all reptiles and all mammals. So you're looking here at a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. That's the idea. And let's look at the forelimb. Here we have a foreleg, and there's a lot going on in there that's pretty similar to what we have. How many bones do we have in our upper arm?
One.
One. That's the humerus. There it is. You get down past the elbow. How many bones in the forearm?
Two.
Two. There they are, radius and ulna. You get into the wrist. We have these small bones in there that are sort of cuboid. About how many of those do we have?
6 or 7.
It's actually 8. And right here, I think I count up 8 of them. So there it's approximately the same arrangement of these carpals that are in your wrist. You get carpal tunnel syndrome, you've got some inflammation in this area. Then you get to the palm of the hand. We have long bones that are here. How many? 5 that are in the palm. There I see them. And then you have the phalanges in the fingers. With our fingers, it's 2 of them in the thumb, 3 in all the other fingers. This is a slightly different arrangement, but it's not very different. Also, above our humerus, we have this blade-like bone up here. What is that one called?
Scapula.
Scapula, or shoulder blade. There it is. So you've got basically all the same bones in approximately the same arrangement. So we think that this was ancestral to all other vertebrates that we see that have approximately the same arrangement of bones. And that includes, for instance, porpoises. You get whales and porpoises that are in the water, but we think those actually originated from land mammals, which then made a turn back into the water. You have bats that are in the air, but again, they have the same basic arrangement of the bones, just the bones are very long and skinny and lightweight. Then we've got the human arrangement. So we think that this type of plan has been modified to produce all of these others, with the porpoises having strong selection to be able to work in the water, bats flying, humans just on land. Divergent evolution. This ancient pattern diverged into several different patterns based on the environments that these animals were living in. And maybe the most extreme case here with the ancient flying reptiles that we don't have anymore, things like pterodactyls and pteranodons. In that case, the most of the wing, most of the spar of the wing is being, or most of the wingspan is being supported by this one spar that was the index finger. The entire index finger grew out to a giant size and supported most of the wingspan. But then we find the other bones that are in there as well. These flyers were typically like 1 meter or so across, but the biggest ones got to about 13 meters. That made them the size of a small aircraft. So these were the biggest things in nature ever to fly. Well, evidence of evolution occurring partly is that many, in fact, most of the ancient species are no longer with us. And many modern species didn't have representatives if you go far enough back in the past. Sooner or later, you don't find them anymore in the fossil record. So there's been a turnover of life, and yet there are threads running through life, like the similar forelimbs that we just saw. That ancient reptile from 300 million years ago is long extinct, but we see a common thread running from there all the way up to the present. And we find many intermediates of fossils. For instance, links between the whales and some land mammals. We think that their earliest ancestor that was still on land was an animal like a wolf, around 60 or so million years ago, an animal similar to a wolf that started spending more time in the water and gradually became adapted to living full time in the water. And part of the evidence for that is that we have early whale skeletons with legs. Modern whales, of course, don't have legs, but early ancient versions of them had legs. So all of this argues for more modern life forms transitioning from the more ancient ones. And we see some evidence of that with what we call vestigial structures. If we look even now at modern whales, we will find, if we're looking at something like a gray whale skeleton, I don't know if that's what this is, but it would be similar. You've got some bones that still exist that are back where legs would be, and these still are serving a function. Some muscles do attach to these, but obviously the whales are not using them to walk anymore. We think what we have here is a tiny remnant of something that used to be a larger and more important structure. And again, going through whale evolution, we find that some of the earliest whales that we know still did have legs, but over time they evolved into the modern forms that not only have lost their legs, but have blowholes on top of their heads. Today, we have two big groupings of modern whales. There's the toothed ones, including dolphins, and orcas and sperm whales, and then the baleen whales, which are the biggest of all. But there are these earlier ancestral forms that we've been able to document pretty well now. So let's see what else to do here. All right, I'm going to put these lecture notes into Canvas so that you have access to all of them. Otherwise, let us go and watch something again. In this case, looking at whale evolution. And I think with that, we'll be done here for today. So let me go and bring up something that I had on whale evolution.
It's a basic human need to ask, who are we?
All right, so this is looking at how we have worked out some of the story on whales. And you would never guess where some of the best fossils have come from. It's about the least likely area you could imagine to find them. But remember, for fossil hunting, we basically look for them on land. And in the case of whales, we have to find areas that are not underwater anymore, but used to be. So let's take a look at this.
Human
civilization stretches back thousands of years. But compared to the age of the Earth, we humans have only just arrived.
The Earth is really old. If you take the entire history of the Earth from 4.6 billion years ago to the present, and to call that an hour, the first 50 minutes are largely spent in a world of microbes, single-celled organisms. Animal life appeared in the last 10 minutes of that hour. All of human history, our civilization, our evolution, happened in the last hundredth of a second of that hour.
We've come quite late to the party, but we've been shaped by the same forces that have helped shape all life on Earth. To understand how we fit in, we need to look back to long before our own origins, to see how other living things evolved. Whales are the largest living animals. Like us, whales and dolphins took on their present forms relatively recently. For a long time, the origin of these marine mammals was a scientific mystery.
Whales are so different from every other kind of mammal that we can't easily relate them to anything else, and so they're off by themselves as a branch of mammal evolution.
Mammals first appeared on Earth around 200 million years ago, on land. Mammals are warm-blooded. They give birth to living young, and they breathe air. These are all adaptations to living on land. But whales and dolphins are mammals too.
They're mammals that live in the water. But we know that mammals evolved on land. So it's a real puzzle how whales originally evolved. By understanding how that happens, we'll begin to understand how these big jumps, these big transformations happen generally.
People are interested in whales, and I can understand. They're so beautiful. Their origin is such a mystery. Whales are one of the few groups of mammals that have really large, complicated brains like we do. And so in a sense, there are alter egos living in the sea while we live on land, dominating the sea while we dominate land. And I think for that reason, we're very interested in what goes on there, how they got there as a reflection of our own history through geological time.
When Phil Gingrich began his career 30 years ago, he knew nothing about whales, and that was just fine with him. He was drawn to geology mostly because he couldn't imagine a career spent behind a desk.
I think I was interested in geology because it was a science outdoors. And in geology, I became interested in paleontology because it was about life and the history of life.
Gingrich's early interest in primitive land mammals eventually took him to Pakistan. It was there that he made the kind of find most paleontologists only dream about. A fossil that would rewrite one of evolution's greatest stories.
I found the back of a skull that I couldn't identify. It had a very good, well-preserved ear region, and that offered the clue to what it was.
The shape was familiar, but in other ways it was like nothing Gingrich had ever seen.
This is the original specimen. It's the one we found in about 1978. There are several things that strike you. One is it's very similar in size and shape to the back of a skull of a wolf.
But there was something odd about this skull. On its underside was a walnut-sized bump.
If this wasn't here, I would think that this was an archaic carnivorous mammal, what we call a creodont. But it is here.
It was part of the animal's inner ear, and it had a distinctive shape. A shape found today in only one kind of animal. Whales. What was the ear of a whale doing on the skull of an animal that resembled a wolf? Gingrich was intrigued, so he constructed a model of what the creature's full skull might have looked like. He wondered, was his find a crucial missing link? The first fossil evidence ever found for one of Darwin's most daring claims, that whales had evolved from land mammals. To know for sure, Gingrich would need to find more fossils. Ones that would show each stage of the whale transformation, what scientists call transitional forms.
I want to line them all up. I want anyone to be able to see it and believe it because they've seen it.
Gingrich tried to return to Pakistan to resume his search, but war had broken out and the borders were closed. Frustrated, Gingrich decided to look elsewhere. He had heard stories about whale skeleton sightings in a very unlikely place, so he decided to check it out for himself. The Sahara Desert is one of the driest places on Earth. But 40 million years ago, things here were quite different.
This used to be the sea. Just think of this being the current Mediterranean coast of Egypt backed up about 40 million years, about 100 kilometers to the south of where it is today.
Here, in what had once been the southern Mediterranean Sea, is a 100 square mile stretch of layered sandstone with a surprising name: Valley of the Whales. The name is well suited. Scattered everywhere across this arid landscape are what look like heaps of rose-colored stones.
Here's a Basilosaurus.
But they're not stones.
You can see how big the vertebrae are. Here's the lumbar partly weathered away.
They're whale skeletons, 40 million years old.
There's another one back here coming out of the mushroom. There's one over here. And back over there's one. This whole place is full of whales.
Why were there so many whales concentrated in this one spot? Gingrich believes that Whale Valley was once a protected bay, a lagoon hidden from the open sea by underwater sandbars. Perhaps the whales birthed their young here and came here to die. But even with hundreds of whale bones at his feet, Gingrich was disappointed. Nearly all of the skeletons belonged to a whale called Basilosaurus, a 40 million year old creature already known to science. Basilosaurus lived full time in the water. If whales had evolved from land mammals, they had done so long before Basilosaurus. So Gingrich didn't think the bones would be of much interest. But he couldn't have been more wrong. After only a few days of digging, he made his second amazing find. It turned out that Basilosaurus had something modern whales have long since lost.
For the first time, we've got whales that have legs.
The bones were small but unmistakable. A pelvis, a kneecap, even toes. This whale had a complete set of leg bones. Gingrich brought back as much of the skeleton as he could carry. It was dramatic evidence that whales had once been four-legged animals. Since Gingrich's finds, he and others have filled in more of this fantastic story. Scientists now think that the earliest ancestor of whales was similar to this 50-million-year-old wolf-like mammal called Synonyx. Synonyx was a predatory scavenger that lived and hunted along the shores of an ancient sea. Perhaps its descendants found the water a source of abundant food and a haven from competition. Over millions of years, front legs became fins. Rear legs disappeared. Bodies lost fur and took on their familiar streamlined shape. Since Gingrich's first find, named Pachycetus, the list of known transitional whales has grown. It now includes Ambulocetus, Rhodocetus, Durodon, as well as Basilosaurus. They reveal another element of whale evolution, the gradual migration of nostrils to the top of the head as whales adapted to breathing in the water.
How did whales lose their legs?
As the years went by, they evolved into newer types of...
Gingrich's work demonstrates what Darwin himself insisted, that the evidence for evolution is all around us if we choose to look for it. And bones aren't the only evidence of whale evolution. Their ancestry is also visible in the way they move. Frank Fish studies how today's marine mammals swim. He looks for their evolutionary heritage in the way they move through the water.
The big question is, how do you go from a terrestrial mammal that ran around on all four legs to something such as a dolphin, which now doesn't have any legs at all and is well adapted to swimming in the oceans?
Even though whales look like fish, they don't swim like them. Fish swim by flexing their spines from side to side, like the shark. But mammals swim differently. This otter swims by undulating its spine up and down, in exactly the same way that whales do. And, as it turns out, in the same way that land mammals use their spines when running. Whales took with them into the water their ancestral way of moving, and we can still see it 50 million years later.
In one sense, evolution didn't invent anything new with whales. It was just tinkering with land mammals. It's using the old to make the new, and we call that tinkering. And it does this in every animal group at every time during evolutionary history.
The starting point for whales was a four-legged land animal that lived over 50 million years ago. But land animals were also the product of a transformation, a much earlier one.
Okay, so I wanted to show you that and just get an idea that evolution can happen on a very small scale, making, say, small changes to a gene within a population. We see that with humans with, for instance, evolving lactose tolerance. So today, we have some people in the world that are tolerant of lactose as adults. They're able to drink milk. Others who are not. But of course, we're all humans. That's what we call a microevolutionary change. But macroevolution is really the generation of new species, new lineages of life forms. That generally takes a lot longer, but there we see an example of that happening with the whales. This macroevolution is the sort of story that's played out through the fossil record going back millions of years. And that's what I've got for you here today. I think probably that's a good place for us to stop. And I'm going to have my office hours today at 11:15. I can take a couple of questions right now if you have them, and otherwise you're welcome to come back to office hours. And then we will be doing labs this week and doing your final Wednesday. So anyone have questions for me right at this time?
I do. My question is about the silencing RNA. I mean, I get where ribosomal and all the other RNAs come into play, but silencing RNA, I'm still kind of confused on.
I'm going to have to look back at that myself, I think, to give you a good answer. And I can just tell you right now that won't be on the final.
Oh, okay. So if I understand correctly, you get DNA, the RNA polymerase, right, makes a copy from the DNA. You get the primary transcript in the nucleus. Then you get enzymes that come in. They take out the introns. They put the 5' the cap and the 3' tail. Then it goes out.
So
and then
you're talking about making the messenger RNA there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, and then after you get rid of the introns, that's where you got the mRNA that's used.
Well, that's now becoming the mature transcript, the mature mRNA.
So the cap and the tail are put on before you get the mature mRNA, right?
Well, that's part of the process of making it the mature one.
Okay.
Basically adding a cap and a tail, removing introns, putting the exons together in their final arrangement. All of that that's all editing happening in the nucleus.
When it comes out, then it goes to the ribosome unit, and first it attaches to the rRNA, right? And then to the A site?
The rRNA is the ribosomal RNA. That's part of the ribosome itself.
But is that where it first attaches?
Well, the messenger RNA is going to attach to the small subunit of the ribosome. And that small subunit is partly made out of ribosomal RNA, rRNAs.
Okay. And then it'll go to the A site, and then the P, and then the E.
That's where the tRNAs are moving through it.
And your tRNA brings your anticodons, and then you get your polypeptide, and that's how you get your proteins.
Yes. It's bringing in the amino acids, and they're matched with the codons in the mRNA.
Okay. So then I won't worry about the silencing RNA.
No, you don't need to.
Is the rest of it, is it okay, or am I messed up?
No, yes, you sounded pretty good there.
Okay, well, thank you.
You're welcome.